Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Space Warfighter Talks. I'm your host, Bill Wolf, the president and founder of the Space Force Association, and I'm honored today to be speaking with Colonel Rob Long, the commander of Space Launch Delta 30. Sir, thanks so much for taking time to talk with SFA today.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for asking, and look forward to a good conversation.
Thank you, sir. And before we get going, I always like to ask our guest speakers to just tell the audience a little bit about themselves. So, sir, how did you end up as a commander of Space Launch Delta 30?
Yeah, it's probably a convoluted story a little bit, but yeah, I started off like many of us actually after getting commissioned. Went into be an ICBM missileer. Did crew operations there for a while. I was actually part of an operational exchange program. So my original AFSC was as an engineer. Did the missile operations thing first for my operations time, and then I actually went over to the National Reconnaissance Office and was working in the NRO as an engineer, but that's where I first kind of fell into working on the launch business. And so I've been really fortunate that I was able to go back and forth between our operations side, the 13S AFSC, and our 6.2 engineering side, and kind of go back and forth doing a little bit of program management, doing operations both across in the NRO and then back out into then Air Force Space Command, of course, and now in the Space Force. So we often, those of us that are kind of in the launch business, we chuckle sometimes about, each of us has kind of grown up in this world a little bit differently, and so our paths are all probably a little bit different, but ultimately, as you start to narrow in on what is kind of that breadth of experience that includes a little bit of operational experience, a little bit of engineering, some acquisitions even, and you kind of build that all together. And that, when you look at what the way we do launch with commercial service providers as our primary means, it's important to kind of have both those, especially as you sit here at a launch base at a Space Launch Delta, and you want to pull in all those things. And I was also fortunate to be the 30th OSS commander before here. So I had even kind of the airfield operations and weather and some of those things that kind of more base support kind of functions. And if you consider that every launch we do really requires the entire team from civil engineers, security forces, and of course our range operations and our space launch squadron folks. So it's just I was very fortunate over a 25-year career to end up number one, even just having the experience that even made me qualified for this job.
Definitely uniquely qualified. Thank you for that, sir. Now, you mentioned the Space Launch Delta 30 mission briefly, but what is the big difference between Space Launch Delta 45 and Space Launch Delta 30? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, the main difference is just which direction we're launching and the kinds of orbits that we are able to service safely. And ultimately, both of us, when it comes back down to it, we're all about public safety. That's our number one job. We're here to ensure every time we launch that we don't endanger the public unnecessarily. And generally, if you're on the East Coast at Space Launch Delta 45, they're going to typically kind of move and go towards a equatorial or a middle inclination orbits. Out here on the West Coast, we're typically looking at polar orbits somewhere, and also we can reach some of the middle inclination orbits too now as we kind of go down the coastline. And of course, the East Coast can also go to the south and do polar also. So the great thing about that is we have started, especially working with SpaceX and some of our current launch providers, and exploring some of those alternative azimuths to launch through. It really gives us a little bit of resiliency between the two coasts. So otherwise, we're really one thing I will say I'm really, I guess, proud of or excited about is, for years we've been really pushing hard to kind of get as similar as possible on the operations side and how we do business. We have made quite a bit of strides to get to that point. And I'm really excited where we're at right now because we're really starting to hit our stride and being more efficient, being streamlined, and hopefully basically acting the same as at least as much as we can coast to coast.
Thank you for that, sir. You mentioned the rate a little bit in terms of being efficient. How has technology evolved such that you've seen an increase of space launch capabilities in terms of numbers? I mean, it used to be few and far between where we'd see a space launch happen. But now with the existing technology that SpaceX has come up with to deliver a capability and then re-land the booster and then quickly reuse the booster, how has that impacted your capacity to get launches in orbit?
Yeah, reusability is definitely one of the keys in terms of being able to just turn launches as quickly as possible. But that then drives the demand signal on the range, of course. And there's a couple of things that have over time, when you look back at when General Raymond laid out his range of the future vision, we set forth making our primary goal was to remove the range as a constraint to launch. And I think we've really, over the last 3, 4, 5 years, have made tremendous strides in getting after that, to the point now where we're launching in some cases once a day, maybe not every day, but we've doubled our launch rate here on the West Coast in the last 2 years. We look to double it again this year. The East Coast is going like gangbusters, and they're launching all the time. So we're setting new records in terms of the time between launches on both coasts. So it's really a great time. And I would add to that, reusability was a key piece, but I will add automated flight safety systems. So that the ability for the rocket to internalize and take on the flight termination and safety aspect, and then remove all of the range equipment that we used to have to bring to bear in order to track the vehicle and then send the command to destruct the vehicle if it's straight off course. The ability to package that all into some software and hardware on the rocket itself, so that it knows when it is going outside of its limits and then can destruct itself. That really allows us to turn fast. And so we're really getting into something of a groove, I would say, in terms of streamlining all of our processes. So it's a bit of a give and take. SpaceX is really pushing on us, and other companies are pushing on us to do more and go faster. And the team's always has responded every time and coming up with new or more efficient or innovative ways to do range operations. So that really I would largely say we've been successful at removing the ranges overall as a constraint to launch.
No, great. Thank you. You bring up a point about the need for structure, and then what the military provides in terms of the structure necessary for space launches. There's a lot of talk about, multiple spaceports standing up around the globe. So how is what you do in the military going to translate to defining and identifying what the needs are for the commercial launch sector? With regard to those spaceports, is there a relationship now, or is there an opportunity for a relationship in the future?
Yeah, there's absolutely an opportunity for a relationship. We consider ourselves spaceports. We're working hard right now on developing the models, the concepts of operation of what is taking something of a port authority model and then merging that with military readiness, so that we make sure we have all bases covered in terms of being able to ready to launch, but at the same time, with the number of commercial launches we're seeing from the ranges right now, ensuring that we're have the right business model at the same time to recoup costs and make sure that we have the overhead paid back into the system for infrastructure and things like that. But really, as you look at it, we don't really want to have just 2 launch ranges. We don't want to have 2 main spaceports, I would say, for our nation. We really want to distribute that. If you think doctrinally in terms of force distribution, you don't want to have everything all co-located into 1 or 2 or 3 spots. So I really look forward. We're working on a spaceport strategy and on the national front that allow us to kind of get after what do we need to have as a nation in order to, and working with our interagency partners on this, is it 3 or 4 sites here? Is it 5, 6? I'm not sure what it is. We're going to work through that. But I also think you mentioned our international partners, and this is where I think our allies will come into play as well. Australia and our 5R partners, the UK, they're all intimately looking into building their own spaceport infrastructure, and that can only help us. And we've had interactions with all those nations that are interested, and I really think that ultimately, we don't have 1 airport for the United States of America, right? We have hundreds, and so we're going to get to that eventually. And so we're just really in those really early stages of that, and it's an exciting time to kind of be thinking about how we're going to do that in the future.
It is an exciting time. I mean, if anybody in the audience has not had an opportunity to go watch a space launch, which you probably take for granted now, sitting in the seat you're sitting in. But every single time, whenever you see that, there's nothing more exciting to see a space launch happen, and to know that based on what's happening there, that capabilities being delivered into orbit. So what an exciting time, as you say.
Yeah, it's definitely. And I'll tell you, I'll be honest up front, I never get tired of watching a launch. Is that probably the best thing about this job, outside of maybe interacting with all the great folks out here, is just the fact that my job is to get to go watch launches and support them. So yeah, you're right. It's exciting. It's a lot of fun when it comes down to it.
Yes, sir. And you know, what you described a little bit ago, what you were talking about is that concept that everyone is kind of focusing on right now, which is hey, what does tactically responsive space look like? I think we could spend just quite a few minutes talking about just the concept of tactically responsive space and then what Space Launch Delta 30 is doing to support that.
Yeah, sure. No, happy to. I think, when we look at it from our perspective as a spaceport or the range, really we want to be ready to launch any payload at any time, regardless of almost agnostic as to where it's coming from, what it is, and maybe to some degree what orbit it's going into. And so we probably need a couple things as we do that. We're working through that under the Victus Nox program right now. And we initiated, we went back to basics and we pulled out JP 05 and just said, hey, how are we going to go ahead and do this on a traditional planning standpoint? Hey, we're going to get the plan order out there and go do it. And we did, and we took a lot of lessons from a lot of different places, and we produced basically some plans now that hey, when the call comes, we'll pull that off the shelf. We know all the things we need to go do in order to be ready to go. And so it's been a really good effort in order to be ready within that 24-hour time frame. But ultimately, that's all based on much of the work that we've done with Range of the Future and similar initiatives up to date. And when I say we've leveraged our experience, the ICBM test mission has actually been really useful for that, because every time we do an ICBM test, it's going out over the Pacific. We have to deal with 3 other ranges, and we have to deconflict all the operations on there. And there was an operation that was moved last fall that really within 24 hours we were able to do all the deconfliction, work all the way up through the Pentagon to understand who the priorities were, and then reset to a later date that wasn't too far down the road. And so you put all those things together, and I think we're getting to the point where we are ready that when the call comes, hey, satellite X is going to show up on Y date, and the launch vehicle is already here and ready to go. The range will be ready and be able to launch that whenever we need to. So yeah, it's exciting, and that's just the first step, right? We're going to continue and keep evolving that model to see what makes the most sense in kind of that exploit, buy, build mantra that we're really focused on.
Thank you. And that exercise you talked about, can you talk a little bit more about what that exercise is, how often you run it, what some of the objectives are, and where the output from the exercise goes? Like who receives that?
Yeah, Victus Nox is actually a demo is probably a better way to say it. So that's an initiative under Space Safari where we're going to take a satellite, build it in a relatively short amount of time, and then we'll be effectively on alert, and we'll be able to say, hey, go. And at that point in time, that's when the launch vehicle will be ready, and the launch vehicle provider will then have to take the satellite, integrate it, get it ready to go, and launch in a very short period of time. So from our perspective at the range, we're really ready to provide. We've done all the pre-analysis, all the planning types of activities, whether that's safety analysis, link analysis, all those different activities, RF spectrum deconfliction. We've done all that for a handful of potential COAs, and then we can pull that off the shelf and say, okay, we're going to go execute COA 1, let's say, and be ready to not only receive the satellite, help the program through that, and then launch it, of course.
Perfect. Now, yeah, you were just at not too long ago. We spoke briefly at the Space Mobility Conference down there in Orlando. And one of the concepts in terms of tactically responsive space is, how do you get the most amount of capability into orbit and then be able to maneuver while in orbit? Can you talk a little bit about what a model could look like such that you deliver something maybe to low Earth orbit and then be able to maneuver into a different orbit?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's good. It's a good point that I think we're seeing this inflection. And when General Purdy highlighted kind of the vision of space access, mobility, and logistics, that's fundamentally what we're really looking toward in the future. When he lays out that vision, it's all about what's the overall logistic stream from taking a payload or a satellite that's on the ground and getting it to the right place in orbit. I think we're seeing the trend in industry to larger launch vehicles, so you can get more payload in the low Earth orbit anyway. Things like SpaceX Starship, Relativity has their Terran R. There's a handful of others that are all looking at these similar kinds of trades in terms of large launch vehicles getting a lot of mass up into low Earth orbit. And then do we have the capabilities, the on-orbit maneuver type capabilities where we can then go on and then help and take something from low Earth orbit, maybe move it to GEO or some other orbit, or back and forth. So I think when you kind of look at that entire chain of trying to get something from the ground into its desired orbit in space or beyond, if you're going XGEO, all of those things I think are starting to come together where we're really seeing industry. And you mentioned the mobility conference. The buzz at that conference was you could feel the energy and just the interest in some of these concepts. And so as we in Assured Access to Space and General Purdy lays out that vision, it's really exciting to be in there and really look at, hey, where do we fit from the launch range perspective? Where do we fit from the enterprise? And it's a great time to be in this business because I think we're really having the opportunity to try some innovative things in order to ultimately make sure we are the most responsive in delivering that whatever the capabilities needed, whether it's on orbit, whether that's through orbit, as we talk about rocket cargo types of concepts. So yeah, it was that conference was great to really see everything kind of start to come together, and then a lot of energy and excitement behind it.
Yeah, perfect. You talk about tactically responsive space and some things, and I'm sure some concepts you and your team have talked about is, will we ever have a capability where you've got a sea launched space delivery capability or an air launched space delivery capability? Right now we're ground launched, from specific locations. Is there a time in the future, an architecture in the future, where the Space Force has to go to another service to request support to deliver space-based capabilities?
Yeah, it's a tough question, kind of looking in the future. I think we would probably be a ways off from that. I think we could probably there's a handful of models. I mentioned the one where you're lifting a lot into a low Earth orbit and then moving it around there. There's probably some others. That's where I come back to. I'm looking at. I think we got to take some initial steps in defining, getting to that freight train mode where whether it's SpaceX or any number, ULA, you can think of Blue Origin, all of the companies that are out there. If they're all launching, let's say once a day with payloads and getting mass to orbit, or multiple times a day, just like you would with a train or an airplane or anything like that, you might be able to then take advantage of that. Excuse me. Operation that's already going on, that launch that's already going on, swap out payloads under kind of a national security need, and then go right there. So then it becomes a question of what's the trade space between moving things in orbit, moving things to orbit, and what's most tactically. I think it's tough. You got to, anytime you're considering kind of the tactically responsive space, is understanding, like, where's my capability going to be? I'm going to have 100 satellites in a hangar somewhere getting ready to launch, or are they going to be on orbit? I think we'd have to want to work with some of the Space Force in general to understand, like, what's the future hold. That's the great thing also about being in Space Systems Command, right, where we actually get a kind of insight into, hey, where's the future going for some of these programs, and it helps us understand when we start to talk about transportation to space versus just launch or something like that.
Thank you. In the Air Force, they have primary aircraft authorizations to define how they develop out, a collection of air capabilities to ensure air superiority. Is there a time in the future where the Space Force has primary spacecraft authorizations for specific combat deltas to, again, provide that same type of capability, so that when and if the adversary chooses to remove some of those capabilities, we know exactly what those lim facts are, the limiting factors, and we can quickly replenish them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's where I go back to, as I mentioned, we'll have to make probably a strategic choice at some point, and it'll depend on a number of factors to understand, how much of that capacity do you want to have on the ground, and how much do we want to stay up in orbit. And that's where I come back to, from my perspective, when I sit here at the spaceport or the launch head, effectively, what do I care most about? And really, it's that agility, right? It's the ability to take whatever desired need is, whether that, if the Space Force has decided, hey, we're going to put a bunch of things in a hangar somewhere and then be ready to launch, that's a great model. We'll be ready to do that. It's kind of similar to what I described on the Victus Nox demo. Alternatively, we also want to be ready to kind of under that any payload, anytime freight train model, so that if we need to make some changes, maybe we go down a road where we determine what are the authorities that we need under a combatant commander, for example. Do we want to have a combat delta or a combat space squadron here, or something like that, where hey, I have the authorities through, CJCS that pass all the way down to the combatant command side. And then it allows me to say, sorry, other service, we're going to take time away from you and your ranges because we need to put something up in orbit. And that's all been pre-done through some sort of planning process, right? So I think there's a lot of different ways we could go. And I think it's probably going to largely be based on the way industry goes in terms of technology. I think, right, if SpaceX and some of these companies are successful at really getting large volumes and large mass to orbit, maybe we don't need to have that. I don't know. I think it'll be interesting to see which way kind of technology goes and some of the innovative things that are going on out in both industry and of course the Department of Defense and the Space Force.
Great. Yeah, that makes sense. From a the space traffic management perspective and debris field perspective, what are your thoughts, and what are you and your team thinking about with regard to, yes, we can deliver capability, but at the same time, we need to be responsible to take capability that's no longer viable as a viable product. How do we get that deorbited?
Yeah, I think that's where that on-orbit maneuver and servicing comes in, right? Debris removal may be part of that component, that mission set, where eventually we're going to need to consider, hey, I got to bring this stuff back down because it's just the best thing for us. Whether it's, hey, I want that orbital slot, it's no longer available. There's obviously, as you know, there's different ways you could look at that, but I could see that, and at the same time, it behooves us to do that. Even just as I look at it from the launch base perspective, we always run the COLA runs, the collision avoidance runs to understand like where are we going to put something into space, and that limits us to a degree, depending because you want to make sure you don't have any conjunctions, of course. But at the same time, maybe we have that in conjunction, and there's probably some parallel operations that could go on in order to make sure that if we need to launch something quickly or be more agile, then it's a little bit of a give and take on where that goes. So yeah, that's what I like about, as we talk space mobility and logistics, that whole idea, that whole enterprise that we're trying to build and go towards, starting with the assured access to space enterprise anyway, is exciting because I think those are all those components that we're trying to build together in the right ways in order to really be agile and delivering capability wherever it needs to go from to space perspective.
Thank you. And then there's a lot of industry folks that want to help. So what would you say to them if they want to help with the missions that you're describing? What's the best way for them to get involved?
I think from our perspective, if you've got a new technology, reach out. I think SSC, Space Systems Command, has a front door, and that's a great place to go and just say, hey, I've got this great new thing, this new concept, even this new idea. And I think we're all open. We're trying to get all those different ideas on the table. That's was great about the mobility conference, space mobility conference, right? It's a place to bring those types of people together. So ultimately, I think those are the key ways, and just reach out to us. I think we're all trying to do this, and the great thing about the assured access to space enterprise that we've created under General Purdy is that we're all integrated, right? This is the first time I would say we were almost vertically integrated on all aspects of what's now turning into space mobility and logistics. We've got the acquisition side, so the folks going out and actually acquiring and bringing in launch services. So that's a great place for some of those in industry to start, all the way through the launch space and into orbit, like I said, in terms of on orbit servicing and maneuver. So yeah, there's a couple different avenues, and always happy to reach out direct, and we'll put you in contact with somebody.
Thank you, sir. And again, with regard to the partnerships that the CSO constantly talks about as one of the main focus areas, is the thought in the conference that we recently hosted, the commercial augmentation of space reserves. So can you talk a little bit about how launch plays into how commercial would augment maybe a space launch Delta 30 mission?
Yeah, I think we're really well postured for that, right? The launch was probably one of the early mission areas that went to a commercial service model pretty early on. And so I think we have quite a bit of experience in considering, what does a commercial service look like? How would we then take advantage of that in a threat scenario where we need additional capability? So I think we're well postured to then say, okay, if I need to take advantage of, hey, there's a SpaceX launch or a ULA launch or a Blue Origin launch, pick your vehicle, and they're already launching, a payload for some commercial company. It would make sense potentially to say, okay, I'm going to use my national need card, and just like I'd pull a aircraft off from a craft perspective. Maybe I take that launch vehicle and say, nope, this one is going to be national security need, put the right payload on top of it, and then get it to space. So I think there's a couple different directions we could go with that over time. But that's all part of this kind of really exciting times where we're really trying to push the envelope of how do we be fast, how do we be agile and get capabilities. And you're right, it's all about those partnerships that we're going to build along the way, both within industry and of course, I would say potentially not only within DoD, within the interagency, NASA and our partners elsewhere, Department of Commerce, for example, but overseas too. So our allied partners are going to be key in that. I could foresee, allies coming up with different launch vehicle models or different approaches that complement what we're doing. So that's why I say it is such a great time to be in this business and really have to get to sit here, especially where I do now, and get to see it kind of all working together.
And sir, last question. Workforce development is critical, and ensuring the Guardian spirit is alive and well. So what is Space Launch Delta 30 doing to ensure that the Guardians assigned there are excited about their mission and want to continue to come to work every day?
Yeah, well, you actually hit it on the nail on the head earlier. It said that launch is one of the, I will call it anyway, or I would argue anyway, that it's the easier one to get people excited about. It's one of the few things that we do in our business where you can actually see the fruits of your labor. So, and throughout probably my time, we talk up every launch. We make those connections between, each launch, and I do this often when I'm out and talking to squadrons and I'm out and talking to different organizations on base. I'm like, I will tie, I ask the question, how are you tied to that mission? Goes back to the NASA janitor story where somebody asked the NASA janitor, in the 60s, what's your job? I'm like, well, I'm putting a man on the moon, right? We're getting into that mindset. I love our med group, for example. They call themselves space medics, and they will tell you backwards and forwards exactly how each one of their jobs contributes to us getting ultimately capabilities on orbit. So yeah, it's fun, and it doesn't take a lot of extra, I would say, to kind of get people energized about doing launch. Sometimes I think it's even a hidden gem at times because until you get out and do it a lot, and in the past where it may have been your launch rates weren't quite the same, and so you have maybe 5, 6, 10, maybe 15 a year if you were really lucky. We're going to do, especially between coasts, we'll do 15 in a month, maybe potentially. That's probably a little extreme, but eventually we're going to get to that. And so, yeah, I don't want to say it'll be old after a while, because so far, like I said, I haven't gotten to that point yet myself. But yeah, it's fun to try to tie the people to the mission, and then living in a place like Vandenberg, as it's just a great place to be, to get to enjoy this kind of national park setting that we do and that we have here. And 46 miles of undisturbed coastline in California is almost second to none. So yeah, it doesn't take a whole lot to get people energized about the mission out here.
Yes, sir. Sir, any last thoughts from you before we conclude?
No, just thanks. Like I said, this is a great opportunity to kind of talk about what we're doing on both the Space Launch Delta side, I would say the AATS, or Shared Access to Space side. It truly, I probably sound like a broken record right now, but it's just truly a fun time to be part of this mission. It's just a great mission to be a part of. And thanks for, giving me the opportunity to kind of talk about it a little bit.
Thank you, sir. Really appreciate your time today. And on behalf of the entire Space Force Association, have a great Space Force Day, sir. Semper Supra.
Semper Supra.